Also, 동아들이야. 되니. 야시 니모 구버디 니몬들이야.
Today, on this ninth day of our summer teaching, I would like to wish all the monks and nuns from our various monasteries and nunneries, the Dharma centers, all my Dharma friends from the east and west of this world, and of all of our friends and relations, primarily in the land of Tibet. I would like to wish you all my warm greetings. Now, this was a text that I was supposed to give yesterday, and it's supposed to have a day off tomorrow. But the text for yesterday, it took some time to actually prepare it well. It was very complicated. Also, as I mentioned the other day, I've been thinking I would like to begin the topic of Buddhism fairly soon, and there are many reasons. The first is that many of you, or is that many of people are hoping that I will speak about this, and they're encouraging me to speak about this. And I have thought that I should get into that topic as soon as I can. And so for this reason, I was unable to teach yesterday. And so I'd like to beg your pardon for that. So today, as I have explained the other day, the traditions of the 6 branches of the Vedas all arose from the tradition of the Vedas themselves and the Brahmanas and the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads, on the other hand, arose primarily from the Upanishads, and so I'd like to introduce them briefly. Now, during the age of philosophy, what happened is at first there were the sutras, and these developed out of the Brahmanas. And then there were the 6 darshanas, or Orthodox Hindu schools, which developed out of the Upanishads. Now, in general, there are many different views that developed in that era. And the main reason for there to be so many different philosophies or views is because the Upanishads, the views presented in the Upanishads, are primarily just records of the ideas that occurred to people, and they appeared in different fragments. They aren't completely logical. They aren't complete logical texts. And so for that reason, within the 6 darshanas, the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools, once the Samkhya school appeared, then only then did a deep and assiduous school of logic developed. And so it was only after the Samkhya developed that this occurred. Now, what are these philosophies investigating? They're investigating the research between the mind and matter, the nature of the world, what is going to happen to us in the future, what sort of plans are best for us to investigate for the future. So these are the subtopics that they investigated in detail. So basically, the first philosophy that had a complete philosophy with all the different aspects was the Samkhya. And because it was first, then all the later schools also had showed a great influence of the Samkhya school. And so if we begin with the Samkhya, then the last of these six darshanas, or Orthodox Hindu schools, is the Vedanta. And so because there are other schools that appeared primarily to investigate the meaning and also the Vedanta also appeared in order to sort of compete with the Samkhya school and then spread widely. And so this is a school that we take great interest in. Now, there's been a lot of interest and research into this school. And in particular, the Advaita or non-dual Vedanta school that has the position that the Brahma and the self are not true. And so for that reason, many people have praised this Advaita Vedanta tradition, the non-dual Vedanta tradition. And so because of the development of these six darshanas, the Orthodox Hindu schools, there's a very complete set of philosophical schools that appeared in India. And so these six schools that developed reached a very high level in terms of the world philosophy and spread widely throughout the world. Not only these six Orthodox Hindu schools, but there are many other schools that also appeared. For example, there's a sutra that is translated into Chinese. It's called the Sutra of the Chatura Woman, and it's very famous in China. Now, it's not all that well known in Tibetan. However, it does speak about the 62 different philosophical views. Likewise, within the original text of the Buddha, in the Tripitaka, in one scripture, it says that there are 96 different views. Now, the views at that time were generally considered inferior views, and so only a few of them have been preserved continuously to the present day. Now, the ones that have been preserved, whom we have the texts for, are for the ones that are contained within these six Orthodox Hindu schools. And among them, the one that is kind of like the most remarkable, and that is the original of philosophy, is the Sankhya school. And so the Sankhya school, for that reason, is very special. Now, the root texts of these six Orthodox schools are primarily written in the sutra style. They're written as sutras. And so the words of the sutras are therefore very easy. They're written in verse, and they're not too long. And so for that reason, if you don't have a commentary, then you just read the root text, it's actually difficult to get understanding. Now, the reason why the root text of the six Orthodox schools is in the form of a sutra is so that it would be easier for students to memorize and easier for them to keep in mind. That is probably why they're written in the style of sutras. And since they're in a very aphoristic style in verse, so they're easy to memorize. If they're written in prose, they would be long sentences that would be hard to memorize. In any case, around the 6th century BC, there was actually a great revolution in thinking philosophy all around the world. There's this, and also the Persian master Zoroaster, and also Confucius in China, and also the Indian sage Kapila, the founder of the Sankhya school. And likewise, the Buddha, they all appeared in the same era, probably within the space of 1 or 2 centuries. And so they all appeared, one after another within this period. So that was a time, that time of the 6th and the 5th century BC was a place where there's a great development and great change in philosophy and thought. So generally, when you think about the philosophy in the world, there are many different philosophies that have come in many different views. But though there are many different philosophies, but fundamentally, the basic questions that they are investigating are actually fundamentally the same. And if we were to think about the basic teachings of philosophies in terms of the 6 questions, like the first of the questions would be like, who am I? Where did I come from? Where will I go? So people wonder, who am I? Where did I come from? And so we had this feeling, it's like we had this feeling that there's a me. And we think, well, where did I come from? What is the origin that I came from? Where am I going to go in the future? What is going to happen to me? So these sorts of doubts occur to us. So that's one question. So basically, when we think about philosophies, only if you have doubts or questions, can you have a philosophy. If you don't have any doubts or questions, then there's no way you can have a philosophy. Now, the second question is, what is the relation between mind and matter? What is the relation between external things and the internal mind? And there are the things that we can see. And there's also the mind that we can't see, but we can feel. So there are these two. And are there any phenomena that transcend these two? Now, the third question is, it's not just us, but how did this external world come into being? When we look with our eyes, they're the things that we see. We don't think anything else, but we wonder, what is this larger universe that is greater than what we can see? And was there in the beginning a creator who made this vast world of ours? And the world changes too, right? Like the sun rises, the sun sets. There are the changes of the 4 seasons. And so who made these changes occur? So that's another section. Now, the fourth question is, now, in case there is actually a creator of this world, what is that creator like? If it's a god or a human, what is this being like? What is its character like? And the reason for this is, when we look at this world, we see a lot of inequalities. Some people are rich, some people are poor. Some people from the moment they're born in good situations, and some people from the moment they're born in bad situations. There are many such situations in the world. So why is it that not everyone has a good situation? Why are some people in bad situations? This is another way of thinking. So when we think about a creator of the world, then we have the question, is the creator of the world compassionate or not? And also, does the questioner have like a form? Is it like a human form, or is it someone with or is it not? It's an inapparent form, kind of like a, that's clear. It's like a God with no actual form. This is a God with a more inapparent form. Now, the next question is, where does wrong and misdeeds come from? So this is the question of good and bad, or virtue and misdeeds. So where do misdeeds come from? What's the origin of wrongs? And likewise, how can we reach a stage of perpetual happiness? Is there a place where we can go where we'll experience eternal happiness, or is it a level of thinking, or so forth? And so there are many such questions that come up. So if we think about if we kind of summarize the questions of philosophy, I think that basically is what they come to. And so I've explained these in order to make it easy for you to understand. Actually, maybe it's better to say this first. Now, generally, when we're thinking about the history of Indian philosophy, but speaking about world philosophy, so now I'm thinking about the Indian philosophy, what they call all those philosophers that respect the Vedic literature as sacred. They're called the Astika schools, or they say that these are they call the Astika, or the schools that present of existence. And so they call all these schools that respect the Vedic literature as positive, or they can be called orthodox schools. Now, those schools that do not accept the Vedas as sacred are called the Nastika. And so this is actually considered like a nihilistic view, a wrong view, a bad view. Now, when you think about the existential view, these are considered the better Hindu schools. And among them, there are 6. These are called the 6 orthodox schools. And these are considered the schools about being. And so these are called the 6 darshanas, or the 6 orthodox schools. So there are the traditions of the 6 orthodox schools, and there are the unorthodox schools. And so what is the dividing line between these two? Now, of course, there are many ways to answer this question, but at that time, they used, if we take the Vedic literature they used at that time and used that as the basis for our investigation, I think that is the most appropriate. And the reason for this is this. There is an Indian master called Madhava Acharya. So this is called Madhava Acharya, and he was probably a 14th century master. And he wrote a text called A Summary of All Views, or a Sarvadarshana Sangraha. And within this, he speaks about the philosophies of 16 different schools in great detail, and then explain the philosophies of the 16 schools. Now, the author himself is a Vedantist, a member of the Vedanta school, so he described how the schools discussed things, and what their attention. He explains them. And he speaks about the distance between those schools and the Orthodox Vedanta school. And so he takes that as, so I'm going to present the order using that presentation as the basis, using his school as as the basis. Now, to give the order, I've got this list here. And the beginning, the first one is the Lokayata school. This is the first one. This is the ones that are higher on the list are those that are more distant from the Vedas, and those that are on the bottom are closer to the Vedas. Now, the school that is furthest from the Vedanta is the Lokayata school. So the Lokayata school is the most different from the Veda school. Now, the second is the Buddhist school. And then after that, there's the Jainism. And then each of them in order. And then the last one I've listed is yoga. Now, here I have not listed the Vedanta. And the reason is because the author who is making the order is himself a Vedanta, and so he didn't put the Vedanta in his list. And so if we think about what the closest to the actual view is the yoga, and then after that, the Sankhya school. So that at the time, the Vedantas, the way they saw the other Indian schools, and the way they considered the distance or the harmony between their view and the other schools, it can be understood by looking at this list. Now, at the time when these philosophies were developing, was like a new age or great revolution in individual Indian philosophy. From one perspective, this is a time when people are newly compiling the old or recompiling the old rituals. They're establishing laws. And they invented new and more complete grammar and poetics. In particular, as I mentioned the other day, they had invested greatly the ideas of geometry, and they reached the heart of geometry. And so there was also great advancement in mathematics. And so in particular, in philosophical thing, there were great developments, so that many different schools and philosophical schools developed. And as these developed, then eventually, then even the Buddhist teachers was able to arise and continue, because it was in such of an environment. And the Buddhist philosophy was able to really distinguish itself and reach a very high level of view. It was in such an environment where it was able to and could reach such a high level. If it had not been in such an environment, then it would have been difficult for Buddhism to develop in India. So to become such a remarkable and such an eminent philosophy, it was because of because there are so many philosophies, which we would consider non-Buddhist or Hindu philosophies, and there was because of the great development in thinking. And so because of this, that Buddhism was able to develop and improve and advance so far. It's because it arose and developed in this environment of India. So if we think about these reasons, we should be grateful to the Orthodox Hindu schools and consider them to be very important. Similarly, when we think about these philosophical texts are really a great accomplishment that the ancient Indian masters have left behind for our entire world. So, in particular, the Samkhya school that was founded by the sage Kapila as like the ancestor school of all Buddha Indian philosophy. So it's an extremely important school. Likewise, the Buddhist teachings that were established by our teacher, the Buddha Shakyamuni, because they're sort of advanced and developed and advanced so far, and became quite impermanent. And so there are a lot of changes that occurred and they've developed gratefully. And so these two philosophies are these two philosophies are like exemplars of the great advances and developments of Indian philosophy of that period. Now I would like to give an introduction to each of these 6 orthodox schools. Now, if I were to, as I go through and give an introduction to each of these schools, if I were to go into detail, then there's a lot to say. It would take 2 or 3 days to explain each of them. But since our primary topic is not the non-Buddhist schools, so primarily I'll just give a little bit of historical background, and that'll be the primary focus of my introduction. And I do not plan to speak too much about the actual philosophy. Now, in the future, if I have the opportunity, I think it's possible that I will have an opportunity to give a more in-depth presentation of them. For example, if in teaching to the Shudras, if I have the opportunity, I will be able to do some research and give a teaching in more detail on them. So if this opportunity arises, I would like to do this. So today, what I like to do is to give just a brief historical background of these schools. So among the first of the 6 orthodox schools is the Samkhya school. Now, among all of the philosophical traditions of India, the Samkhya are recognized as being the oldest. Not only that, within the entire world, it's the Samkhya is like the earliest philosophical tradition of the world. I think so. It is permissible to say this. Now, the word Samkhya appears in the Upanishads. Even before the Samkhya school developed, this word was used. Now, of course, there are many different ways to explain the name, but the original meaning of the word is counting. So among all the academics who research the Samkhya school, one of the most important and influential is a German scholar named Garbe. What he explains is that the reason why the school is known as the Sankhya, or the counting school, is that all phenomena are included within the count of 2 original constituents that they're made up of. And likewise, all the natures of everything are included within 20. And so because everything is called counting, everything is counted within this. So all the other schools started to ridicule them as counting. Oh, they're just counting things, and called them the counters. And so for that reason, they were given the name Samkhya school. And so this is what this scholar says. Now, so who is the founder of the Sankhya school? This founder of the Sutra school is generally accepted to be the sage Kapila. Now, the reason why he's called Kapila is this is because he's Kapila means light yellow. And so his body was light yellow in color. So he's called Kapila, or light yellow. Now, he had a student named Asuri. And Asuris had a student named Panchashika. And so these are there are many different students and teachers, but these are among the best. But the question of it's difficult now to say how important they actually were in the and what impact they had on the Samkhya tradition. It's difficult to say because they didn't leave any traces behind. But in particular, later people would have as much faith and reverence as for the sage Kapila as they would for a god. Now, that sort of reverence did not occur for the founders of the other schools, and so, but it did happen for Kapila that he was revered as a god and as a great being. Now, the main reason why people developed such love and affection for Kapila is that, in a historical reason, it had been a very long time. He was very ancient, and a long time had passed since he founded the system. And so for that reason, he was considered very important. For example, the Buddha, the sage Kapila, was also very well known, even a century before our teacher, the Buddha, appeared. So for one perspective, he was a great thinker, a logician. He was the founder of a tradition. And he's among the oldest founders of a tradition, and so that's one reason why. But he probably didn't have that many students who actually upheld his tradition. And so for that reason, his position, his philosophical school remained philosophy, but it really didn't become an actual religion. Sometimes we talk about the difference between religions and philosophies. But for one thing, as we think there's not much of a difference between a religion and a philosophy, but there is a difference. For example, like within our Buddhist tradition, especially in the Tibetan tradition, we talk about the four different philosophical schools. For example, we think about like the Madhyamaka school, the middle way school. We think about them as a philosophical school or as a philosophical school, but not as a religion. But the non-Buddhist schools did not really rise to the status of like being a religion, not like Buddhism, which became like Buddhism. Actually, the Sankhya school was a very ancient philosophy and a very influential school, but it was not able to turn into a religion in its nature. Now, the second thing I'd like to speak about is the fundamental texts of the Sankhya school. Now, the six orthodox schools had texts that they considered the most important, the fundamental schools. Now, all of these were written in the style of a sutra, in verse. So they're written as sutras, but for the Samkhya school, there is a Samkhya sutra, but there is a lot of debate about whether the Samkhya verses can be identified as like a root text. And the reason I'll talk about later. So now within the Samkhya school, the text they consider the most important is called the verses on the Samkhya, or in Sanskrit, the Sankhya Karika. So the Sankhya Karika, this text was written by Ishvara Krishna. So his name is Ishvara Krishna. So it's written by Ishvara Krishna, probably in the 5th or the 4th century BC, it is considered. Now, the Samkhya Sutras traditionally they're said to have been written by the founder, the sage Kapila, and this is often said. But people who research this actually have a debate about whether these Samkhya Sutras were written by Kapila or not. Now, the reason why there is because there is no discussion of this text in the early Samkhya text. They don't mention the Samkhya Sutra, and they do not quote from it either. And so if the Sankhya Sutra was written by Kapila and was so apparent, then they would have to discuss it and quote from it, but they don't even discuss it. Now, the second reason is that within the Samkhya Sutra, there are many traces of the Vedanta on it. There's a great influence of the Vedanta, and there are many signs of the Vedanta within it. And so for that reason, they assert that it was written by by a scholar of the Vedanta school, somewhere maybe in the 9th century or perhaps in the 14th century. This is what the scholars say. Now, above, I mentioned the name of the scholar named Garbe. And he says that the earliest time that the Samkhya Sutras could have been written was probably in the 14th century, probably no earlier than 1380. And the latest date is around 1415 AD. And so he identifies this as the period when the Samkhya Sutras were written. And so for this reason, researchers doubt that the Sankhya Sutras are written by Kapila. So now, in place of that, the most important Samkhya text is the verses on the Samkhya, the Sankhya Karika. Now, there are 7 well-known commentaries on the verses on Sankhya in India, but I don't have time to recite the names of it, so I won't speak about them now. In Chinese, though, there's a text called the 70 Golden Verses, which is also a Samkhya text that was translated into Chinese. It was translated by Yangda Tempa. It's called Master Wensi in so he was actually a Korean monk. His homeland was Korea, and in that time, it's during the Tang Dynasty. And so this Master Wensi wrote a long commentary on the Sutra of Unraveling the Thought. And then he speaks about this verse over and over again. And so he's often written about. So in this 7th century, he translated the 70 Golden Verses into Chinese. Now there's a story about why it's called the 70 Golden Verses, but I don't need to tell that now. Now there is debate as to whether these 70 Golden Verses are the same as the Samkhya verses written by Ishvara Krishna. So that is speaking about. Now I don't need to speak about that in detail. I've spoken about the texts. Now I'd like to speak about the tenets, not in detail though. Now, basically, the Samkhya is fundamentally a dualist system, saying that all noble phenomena come from 2 basic constituents. And what those 2 basic constituents, the first of them is the person or the Purusha. This is what we call the person or the Purusha. And so it's also called the self. And it's in cognition by nature. It is the knower, it's the consumer. Another name of it is, the name of the other constituent is called the primal nature or pradhana. So it's called primal nature or the fundamental nature. Now that is material by nature. To explain it very simply, what it's saying is you've got one cognitive constituent, and then so among the constituents you have one's a cognitive constituent, one is a material constituent. So that's basically what it is. Now, this has the 3 qualities and the 20 manifestations and so forth. So instead, this is a time when I'm not speaking about the tenets of the philosophical schools. There's a lot of, now I've done a lot of research into this until I got a headache from it. There's a lot to say, but I think it's better not to speak much about it today. If I speak in brief, then you won't understand. And if I say too much, there's not enough time. And so it's difficult. And so for that reason, and there's no need to speak about that, but basically, it's a dualistic tradition with two basic constituents. You've got there's the self, which is the Purusha, which is primarily not knowing, and then you've got the primal nature, is basically material. Now, all phenomena are said to arise from the primal nature. And so, unless I went into great detail on this, it'd be very difficult for you to understand. Now, the second philosophical school is the yoga school. Now, the yoga school is positioned. The Sankhya school is actually an atheist school. They say that there is no creator of the world. They say to say there's a completely no deity. There's no logic to prove that there's no creator. And you can't prove validly that there's any creator of the world. And so that's the view that they have. And because it has that basic view, so many of that time did not really support the Samkhya system. The reason for this is that most people thought that there was a good, thought that God was important and sacred. And so, because they thought this way, they didn't support the Sankhya position. And so in order to rectify this fault, then the yoga philosophy arose. Now, this yoga school, if we think about it from another perspective, the yoga school upholds the tenets and accepts the tenets of the Samkhya school, but then they, in addition to that, they also hold that there is a supreme deity, Ishvara, that they worship and have devotion for. And then they also had some particular aspects of the secret practice of yogic perception. So basically, the yoga school, in terms of the philosophy, takes the Samkhya school as the basis and then adds some practices of yoga to that. And so for that reason, it's not a philosophy that brings out something special and separate from the Sankhyas. In actuality, the yoga schools are what you could say the theistic Samkhya's. You could say that they're the atheistic and the theistic traditions, right? To talk about the theistic Samkhya's, that would be the yoga school. So generally, to talk about the meaning of the word yoga, the word itself appears in some Aryanas and some Upanishads, and so for that reason, we can say that the practice of yoga had already existed prior to this, and it developed gradually. Likewise, it speaks in the Mahabharata as if the yoga school were present in its time, or that the Mahabharata was after the tradition had developed. But when researching this, that a yoga tradition that has a character of a philosophy, that it was had a fully developed text, was after the writing of the sage Patanjali. So he was founded by this sage Patanjali, and the reason why he wrote this is that he wrote a text called the Yoga Sutras. And after he wrote this, only then did a yoga school with a complete philosophical tradition arise. Now, the dates for Patanjali's birth and death, we can't say. This is the biggest problem in Indian history. The biggest question is that when you speak about the great beings, the beings who are great scholars and accomplished masters, and you say, when did they were born, when did they pass away? You can't say them all. There's no dates for any of them. Now, when researchers look into this matter, the way they research is that in the 4th century before BC, before the Common Era, there is the sage Panini, whom we mentioned the other day, who wrote the great text on grammar called the Panipa, the Panipa grammar. Now, there's a commentary on the grammar by Pani called the Mahadhyasam. And this commentary was written by the sage Patanjali. So if we look at that commentary, we can see that Patanjali was probably an author from the 1st century of the Common Era. But there are people who doubt whether it actually was Patanjali who wrote the commentary on the Panini's grammar. And there are other people who say that Yoga Sutras are actually not written by a single author. But instead, there are many fragments of Yoga Sutras that were compiled over a long period of time, of many years, by many different yogis. And that it was around the time of Nagarjuna in the 2nd or the 3rd century, the Common Era, that the actual text was completed. Now, there are some other scholars who say that the Yoga Sutras and their author probably appeared in the 5th or 6th century BC. So there are many different positions on this because there's no clear history of this. So when you are doing research into the history, it's not clear. So the scholars come up with many different hypotheses. Now, generally, when we think about the Yoga Sutras, it has 4 chapters. There are 4 basic chapters to this Yoga Sutras. And so there are 4 chapters. And the first chapter is called the Samadhi Pada, the chapter on Samadhi. The second is called the Sadhana Pada, the chapter on practice. The third is Vibhuti Pada, the chapter on power. And the fourth is Kaivalya Pada, or the chapter on isolation. So isolation here means liberation. The Samkhya is called liberation, isolation. So it's basically when you have the Purusha, the self, remaining alone. When the self is separated from the primal nature and exists on its own, this is called isolation or liberation. So that is why it's called this. So it has the 4 chapters. So now what it teaches in the Samadhi Pada, the chapter on Samadhi, it teaches about Samadhi, to the practice of Samadhi. Now what we mean by Samadhi is like when you have limit the movement of the mind, limit the movement of the mind from the focus. That's like the level of the mind where you attain that. So in order to limit the motion of the mind, you have to train constantly in this. You have to instill the habits into this. You have to instill the habits of mindfulness and awareness. It does not happen all at once. In addition to that, you have to have faith and devotion for Ishvara. And through this, the superior experiences of yoga arises. So that's basically what's taught in the chapter on Samadhi. Then there's the Sadhana Pada, the chapter on practice. And so there are various methods for developing the superior practice of yoga. There's many different ways to do it. They teach that there are 8 different methods, and among the basic ways that are the last 3, which are called dharana, jhana, and samadhi. These are like the essence of the practice of yoga. If we achieve samadhi, then what happens is that we develop miraculous powers and clairvoyant powers. And we are freed from the bonds of birth and death and achieve the state of liberation. So this is what it teaches. The next chapter is a chapter on yoga and vibhuti, which teaches on clairvoyance. If you met clairvoyance, and so if you meditate on samadhi, what happens is you develop clairvoyance. And so it speaks about knowing the past and future events, hearing sounds in all directions, knowing about situations in other worlds, being able to have conversations with gods and spirits, being able to fly in the air, to walk on the water without sinking, and gaining many other superhuman powers. And so I don't need to speak about them in detail, but basically the yogas, so there are many differences. So in terms of the practice and the practice of yoga, there are many differences from the Samkhya, but in terms of philosophy, it's essentially the same. Now, during the time when yoga was developing, it was actually very close to the assertions of the Samkhya. And it basically accepts the basic presentation of the 25 nobles without any alteration. But the Samkhya vows are basically saying that there is no atheist, or they say that there is no valid reason to say that there is no creator of the world. But instead of that, the yoga school asserts that there is the god Ishvara, or Maheshvara, the great Ishvara. And so because they assert that there is a god, the Samkhyas are called the godless Samkhya, or the atheist Samkhya, and the yoga school are called the theistic Samkhya. So these within this Tibetan text on the philosophical schools, they speak about the theistic and the atheistic Samkhya schools, but they don't speak about the yoga school. They don't use the term the yoga school. And the reason is because of the similarities in their philosophical views. But now one big difference is that the yoga school asserts that there is a god and a permanent Ishvara who is other than the Purusha and the primal nature. They assert that there is this. Now, the relation between Ishvara and the self is that so the god is like the universal of all Purushas, and the Purusha is like the individual self, but there's no time to go into great detail, so I will not speak much about it. So in brief, the yoga school's feature is that it takes the Samkhya tenets and with a presentation of a god and unites these two. And this becomes like a distinctive quality of the texts on the yoga school. And so for that reason, this was very appealing to Indo-Aryan people. And so it had a very full presentation on logic, and it had this the Sankhya schools of thorough logical analysis. In addition, they had the presentation of God, and so for a short period of time, people were very smitten with it, and they thought it was great, and they followed the yoga school. But what's disappointing is that at that time in the society, there became more like a superstitious or blind views. And it's like the Tantra, the people began to they developed a great interest in the mantras, such as were taught in the Atharva Veda, as I mentioned before. And so the practice of mantras, now them speaking the practice of mantra here, it's different from our practice of mantra. When they're practicing the practice of mantra at that time was primarily was because of their interest in accomplishing things for this lifetime, not for future lifetimes. They took a great interest in the practice of mantra. And so this is so at the beginning, the mantra school was not very important, but in the end, they're fooled by the teachings on mantra, and they began to make giving sacrifices, and it made animal sacrifices and very cruel sacrifices. And because they had so many sacrifices, the Nadra school lost its high regard in the status, and it decreased in status till in the end. So at the beginning, the yoga school really spread very widely. In the end, it declined very rapidly. And so for that reason, it did not spread very widely and could not maintain its status for a long period of time. So now we will take a 30-minute break.
Hola, Sudadene. Toki di Runa, Subade Garesana.
Now, the third of the six Orthodox schools is the Nyaya school. So good. Now, there are different spellings for it. So this is the school that developed the presentation of the logic and validity. So they primarily, it's like the ancestor or the root of all the Indian logical traditions. So they're called the Nyaya, or the logical school. So in Sanskrit, it's called the Nyaya Vidya, or the logical knowledge. But when we say logical knowledge, in Tibetan, it's not. It is not convenient. So it's shortened to Tibetan into Rikpa-Chempa. It is said. Now, the founder of the Nyaya is traditionally said to be the sage Gautama. Now, the sage Gautama and another sage named Akshapada are sometimes said to be the same and some to be said different. There are people who say they're the same and people who say they're different. There are two schools or two camps. So generally, among the ancient sages, there are three well-known ones who are known by the name Gautama. The first one was the one who first compiled the sutras, began the tradition of sutra literature. The second is the founder of the Nyaya school. And the third is our teacher, the Buddha Bhagavan, who is also called the Gautama. So when we use the name, it is important for us to understand which of these people we're speaking about. It's now when we say Gautama, we're not referring to our teacher, the Buddha. So since Gautama is the one who established the systems of logic, and so his name is for this reason very well known among Buddhist scholars. He is someone who many people have heard about. So if you wonder when Gautama lived, again, as before, we don't know. The Indians didn't take any interest in dates or history. So if you ask one was he born, one who has died, there's nothing to say. So when scholars research this, they estimate that he probably lived in the period sometime between 150 BC and 50 BC. Similarly, and particularly, there is a treatise by Nagarjuna called The Finely Woven, which lists of the 16 points of the Nyaya Sutras and refutes each of them in turn. And so from this, we can see that, that Gautama was either contemporaneous with Nagarjuna or earlier than Nagarjuna. So what is the basic text or the fundamental text of the Nyaya school? What is recognized as the main text of the school? It is a text called the Nyaya Sutra. This Nyaya Sutra is what is considered most important. Now, this Nyaya Sutra is traditionally said to be written by the sage Gautama, and it has 538 stanzas and 5 books. And the earliest commentary on the Nyaya Sutra is the commentary on the Nyaya Sutra from the 5th century. There was a scholar named Vatsyayana. So there's his commentary on the Nyaya Sutra. So that was the earliest commentary. And so this master, the author of this commentary, is probably one generation earlier than Dignaga. He probably lived at the same time as Master Vasubandhu, and he was a great master of logic. So the text on logic began among the non-Buddhists in the Brahmanical traditions, and gradually they spread into Buddhism. And after the 5th century, within the Buddhist tradition, the traditions of logic and validity spread very widely among Buddhist traditions as well. And this is primarily because of the influence of the masters Dignaga and Dharmakirti. These two, you could say, they're the early logical masters, the earlier masters on validity. Excuse me. So these two basically refined and made a new, they refined the teachings on logic from the earlier logical traditions, and they wrote new commentaries on validity. So they are known as the later masters of validity. So now, if we look at the positions of the modern Nyayas, their positions are different than the early Nyayas, whose positions were described and refuted by Dignaga and Dharmakirti. And so this shows that in the meantime, between them, there was a great influence of the Buddhist validity logic. In particular, there was Dharmakirti, and even more important than well-known than Dharmakirti was Dharmottara, who wrote a commentary on the Dharmakirti's ascertainment of validity, which had a very great influence on the Nyaya tradition. And so after that, their positions on validity and logic became much more in accord with the Buddhist positions. And so it's like the Nyayas themselves said that they incorporated it into their tradition. Now, the greatest impact that Gautama had was his establishment of a complete system by way of 16 different categories. Now, this establishment of complete system and of logic and philosophy by way of 16 different categories wasn't just making a new intellectual tradition. Its primary aim was to realize the suchness of the real nature. And so this is why he made this presentation. And in particular, the most distinctive feature is the presentation of inferential logic, and in particular is for the well-known 5-part syllogism. And so this 5-part syllogism was later used very frequently in logic and became a very influential. So I'm giving here, put an example of these. We talk about the hypothesis, the reason, the analogy, the reaffirmation, and the conclusion. So there's this way, there are the 5 different aspects of a syllogism. And so it's like, first, there's fire on the hill, that is the hypothesis. There's a positionist, there's fire. And the proof of the reason is there is smoke above the hill. This is the reason. And now the analogy for this is, wherever there is smoke, there is fire. Like, for example, like in a kitchen. The kitchen is the analogy. And then the reaffirmation is saying there's smoke on that hill. And then the conclusion is, therefore, it is decided, since there is smoke, there is fire. It is decided. And so he uses these 5 different, so he uses this these procedures of inference to establish the meaning. And so this is the 5 stage or the five-step syllogism. Now, if you take away either the first two or the last two of the five-step syllogism, it is very different than the same as the term logic developed by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. So when you talk about term logic, it's exactly the same, or syllogism, it's exactly the same. Now, these two systems of logic developed in completely different areas, one in the East, one in the West, one in Greece, one in India, but they appeared at about the same time. And so people began to wonder, why did they appear at the same time? One's in the West and one's in the East, but they have the same explanation. So how did that happen? So people began to question this. Not only did they question this, some people in researching this said that there must be some sort of a causal relationship between the two. No, there is not any documentary evidence of this, but the hypothesis or the guess is that because of 2 points, they decide that it can be decided, that they say that this can be decided. And the first thing is they say that it first developed in India and later in Greece. And the second point, if we compare the Greek logic to the Indian logic is on a much higher level than the Greek. And so they say perhaps when the King Alexander, so Aristotle was actually Alexander's tutor. And so when Alexander went to invade India, and he had a connection to India. And so the logic was taken from the five-part syllogism, was taken from India, and then his tutor studied it, they said. And then the teacher himself, Aristotle himself, he was very intelligent. And so he completed it and make it even and improved it. So there are some people who say this. That's a brief introduction to the Nyaya school. Now, the fourth school is this. The fourth is the Vaisheshika school. Now, the Vaisheshika school arose because if you think about the yoga school, for example, the yoga school saw that in the Samkhya school, there is no position of a god. The Samkhya school said that there's no proof that there is a creator god. And so people, the way people saw it, people thought they don't worship God, they don't have a god. And so for that, then people had that feeling. And so for that reason, there weren't so many supporters of the Samkhya. And so what the yogas added the idea that there is a god. And so they added a postulate to the Samkhya school. Similarly, what the Vaisheshika school saw the faults in the Nyaya, and they rectified this and added some points of their own and became the Vaisheshika school. Now, traditionally, it's said that the founder of the Vaisheshika is the sage Kanada. Now, he has other names, the Kanabhuj or Kanabaksha. So these are names he's called by as well. So he has several different names. And another name is called the sage, the owl sage, or Ulukpa. Now, the reason why he's called the six-center grain eater is that when the sage himself was practicing austerities, this is something that the non-Buddhists often practiced, austerities and ascetic practices. And when he did it, he would subsist on others' leftovers. He'd always go looking through the trash, looking for the seeds and grains in other people's, in other people's leftovers, and so he'd eat those. And because he ate these small bits of food, he was called the small bit or the ecosystem. Now, the reason why it's called the owl school is the Buddhist scholars say that he determined it 6 categories because of an owl's hooting. This is the Buddhist scholars say this, but the Vaisheshika do not say this. They say that the name Ukbawa it actually comes from the name of his clan, the Uluka clan. There's no discussion among the non-Buddhists of him being called Uluka because of establishing the 6 categories because of the owl hooting. Now, there's also people say that the word kana in his name means an atom, and since in his school they say that the external world is made entirely of atoms, his name means a proponent of atoms. Now, the root text, or the original text of their tradition, is the Vaisheshika Sutras that were written by the sage Kanada. This is what they recognize as their basic text. But if you want to know when it was written, then the dates are not at all clear. So one thing we have to remember here is that India is like a very strange place. For the one place, they have like no history. They had no tradition of recording history. And from another perspective, they had so many traditions that they actually memorized everything. And when you memorize it, for many generations, they only memorized things and never wrote anything down, because if things are written down, then other people could, if there's nothing written down, then later scholars cannot figure out when it was written, because there's no evidence of when it was written down. There's no written documentary evidence, and so there's no evidence of when it was written, of when it was composed. If something is memorized, when a person dies, then that memory is lost, and so the texts may have been written down or may be memorized, but if they were not written down, when modern researchers examine them, they cannot find any proof that they existed. And so that is one difficulty. So what some researchers say about the dates of the Vaisheshika Sutras, there are some people say that it was before the appearance of Buddhism. Some people say that it was either in the 1st century or the 2nd century, beginning of the 2nd century in the Common Era. So these are 2 different positions. Now, the Vaisheshika Sutras has 10 chapters and 370 stanzas. Now, the earliest commentary, was written by a master named Prashashtapada, and it is called the Compendium of the Properties of Matter. And this is considered the earliest commentary on the Vaisheshika Sutras. Now, the Vaisheshikas say that there were 2 earlier commentaries, but these 2 commentaries are no longer extant. In any case, the earliest commentary that is still extant is this commentary by the master Prashashtapada. And if you think about the tenets or the distinctive features of the Vaisheshikas, the position that the entire world is made up of atoms, and that the atoms are made, that the atoms are unchanging and eternal, so they're permanent, and there are an innumerable number of them. So the entire world was made up of atoms, and so the atoms have to combine. So how do they combine, and how do they separate? It's because there's a hidden power. There's a power that we cannot see, a hidden power that causes the atoms to combine and then to separate. So there's this hidden power that causes this to happen. In any case, the entire world is made up of atoms. And the composition of the atoms was not created by God. They're accumulated by the hidden power. And the power probably came about because of the power of karma. It seems that this is what they assert. So basically, the the heart of the Vaisheshika system is like an investigation of it's really an investigation of the material world. So sometimes it might be more appropriate to say that rather than being a philosophy, it is actually more like physics. And this tradition is probably the first tradition in India to investigate physics. So there are scholars who postulate this. So because in any case, they say that everything is made up of atoms. And so that's enough about the Vaisheshika school. Now, the fifth school is the Mimamsaka school. The Mimamsa means, before I speak about the Chipao or the Mimamsa school, so when you speak about the Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, and the Vaisheshika, they accept the Vedanta, the Vedic literature, but they aren't directly connected to the Vedas. But the Mimamsa actually is two parts. There's the earlier and the later. And the earlier is called the Mimamsa, and the latter is called the Vedanta. So both the earlier and the later Mimamsa all of their explanations come directly out of the Vedic literature. So within the Indian history of literature, they're considered the most orthodox of the orthodox views. So they're showing that they're completely orthodox, because the determination of orthodoxy is how close they are to the Vedas. This is what's said in the Vedic philosophies in general. So when you talk about Mimamsa, it was originally one school, but gradually it turned into two schools, the Purva or early Mimamsa, and the later Uttara Mimamsa or the Vedanta. Now, so what are the causes that made these two schools develop? And said at that time, most of the philosophies of that time were leaning towards an atheistic direction, saying that there's no, they didn't say that there was no God, they didn't say that there is no God, but they said that there's no true valid proof of there being a creator of the world. And so for that time, the philosophy of that times were going in an atheistic direction. So this doesn't mean that they are not related to deities. It basically means in terms of a creator god is speaking about. They said that there are the gods whom you make sacrificial offerings to, but it's the question of whether there's a creator god who created the entire universe. It was only the non-Buddhist Lokayanta school that said that there's no God at all, no virtue or misdeeds. But the other Orthodox schools went in the direction of being a non-theistic schools, and so the Mimamsaka school developed in order to uphold and preserve the traditional views exactly as they were. The other schools had been making attacks on sexual offerings, and so they wanted to preserve the traditional views of the Brahmas. And the reason for this is that they had such attachment to the Vedic and the Brahmana schools, and so they had no choice but to uphold and preserve these traditions. Because at this time, the Samkhya had kind of made many refutations of the idea of a Brahma or a creator god in the Brahmanic philosophy. The Buddhists had said that they eliminated the distinctions in the caste and taught that rituals were meaningless. And these were both very influential. And so, for that reason, in that period, the Mimamsa put a lot of effort into proving their position. And where they mainly put their efforts was in the rituals. They explained why the rituals are so important. Now, and then later, the Vedanta primarily put their focus onto the philosophy of the Vedas, and stating that there's a world that has a creator and so forth. So later, the Vedanta school, which preserved and propagated the meaning of the old Upanishads, and it became like the ancestor or the mother of all modern Indian or Hindu philosophies. So you can say that all the Hindu philosophies come out of that. So first, when we're speaking about these, the early Mimamsa, the first of the two Mimamsa schools, the early Mimamsa schools, if you wonder who was it founded by, it was founded by the sage Jaimini. So Jaimini was his name, sage Jaimini. Now, if you wonder what were his dates of his birth and death, again, we can't say anything about it. Traditionally, it is said that it's traditionally it's said that he wrote the Mimamsaka Sutras around 200 BC. However, but the Mimamsa school developed based on the Mimamsa school, or is there no connection between the Mimamsa and the Mimamsa school and the Mimamsaka Sutra? Now, the researchers are really looking at this. If you look at the Buddhist scriptures preserved in Chinese, so Buddhism spread in China before it spread in Tibet, right? So if we look at when the texts, when the name appears in there are many earlier texts that were translated into Chinese earlier than they're translated into Tibetan. So if we look at the scriptures in Tibet, the word Mimamsa appears only in about the 4th century. It's only in the text of a text by Bhaviveka called the Commentary on the Lamp of Prajna that the word Mimamsa appears. Also in Dharmakirti's treatise on a Vajra needle, it appears there. So if we look at these, we see that the Mimamsa developed sometimes between maybe the 5th century BC and the 5th and 6th century CE. And so it's like a very long time. You have to have that such a long period when it could have arisen. You can't point a specific date. Now, there are the Mimamsa Sutras that are said to have been written by the sage Jaimini. And this has 12 chapters. And of these 12 chapters, there are 60 different sections. And there are 2,742 stanzas. So among all of the root texts of the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools, this is the longest sutras. The other schools are not that long, just a few hundred stanzas. There are few of them that go over 1,000 stanzas. Now, the earliest commentary on the Mimamsa Sutras that we have is one by a master named Shavara called the Shavara Bhashya, the Shavara commentary. And this is the earliest commentary on the Mimamsa Sutras. And the later Mimamsas used him as the greatest source and greatest basis for their own commentaries. Now, this commentary makes a very clear differentiation between the Mimamsa and the Vedanta, because originally the Mimamsa and the Vedanta were one school, but gradually divided into two. So it is in this commentary that the differentiation between the Mimamsa and the Vedanta is clearly defined. Now, the tenets of the Mimamsa school is that primarily is that everyone has a responsibility, and what that responsibility is to practice the rituals taught in the Vedas. We absolutely must practice the rituals taught in the Vedas. For example, if we are in we're speaking, say, in our monasteries to the monks and nuns who do pujas. We say, you have to do rituals, we say. So, for example, within the Vedas, there is a lot about rituals and practices. And it also, the Mimamsas also explain what are the reasons for them, the Vedic rituals. And it encouraged people to engage in the practice. So in this respect, in terms of the philosophy, there's not a whole lot to say about the Mimamsa school. And it might be more appropriate to call the Mimamsa a ritualist school than to call them a philosophical school. But in terms of a profound philosophy, it's like they didn't really reach out to make a deep inquiry. Now, the Mimamsa preserve the tradition of the Vedas and speak about the such great reverence for the Vedas, and it comes down to the Vedas. And so what they're saying is that the words of the Vedas are impermanent and naturally present, that the words of the Vedas are naturally present and permanent, and that the sages heard them and then were able to write them down. And so they say that these words are permanent. The Vedas are so important, right? And the words don't have an author. They're just natural words that people heard. And so they propose that words are permanent. So now, generally, the Mimamsas may not have so many philosophical positions, but they primarily are involved in ritual. So what is the reason why they're considered one of the six Orthodox schools? It's because even though in terms of their philosophy, they didn't do any great inquiry, but their way of explaining the meanings of the text was really particular. The way they would explain them is that first they would explain the meaning of the text, and then they would bring up all of the different questions and doubts. They'd present all of the doubts. And then they say there are this logic that refutes the objections. And then they present the reasons for proving. In our Tibetan text, we speak about presenting our own tradition, refuting other traditions, and proving the position in Buddhist text. And so it's very similar in the Mimamsa. And so they have this way of explaining texts in a similar manner.
That's
basically, so it's probably better to speak about the second of these schools. The second Mimamsa school, the second branch of the Mimamsa, and this is among the six Orthodox schools, is the sixth, the Vedanta. Now, the founding of the Vedanta, the conditions for its founding, is at first the Mimamsa and the Vedanta were one, and later they split into two, as I mentioned before, right? And the Mimamsa primarily were based on the four Vedas, the Brahmanas, and the Brahmanical literature, and they primarily investigated these. And for these, they are called the early Mimamsaka school. So you call them the early. You can call them the early Mimamsaka, or you can call them the ritual Mimamsa or karma Mimamsa. Now, the Vedanta, among the Vedic literature, the Vedanta school primarily explained the philosophy in the Upanishads, or the section on wisdom in the Upanishads, and so they're called the later Mimamsa, or the Jnana, the wisdom Mimamsa. And so those who are examining wisdom. In particular, the Vedanta are also it had a great inquiry into Brahma, or the logic of Brahma. And so they're also called the Brahma Mimamsa, the analyzers of Brahma. So basically, in brief, as I mentioned before, the Mimamsa and the Vedanta were are like a very important representative of the Orthodox Hindu schools and of the later Hindu schools. And the reason for this is that the Mimamsa are like the source for the present ritual practices of present Hindu ritual practices. And the Vedanta are the sources for the views of the Hindus, present-day Hindus. Now, the reason why they split into two, and when they split into two, if you wonder that question, this is again, it's difficult for researchers to give a specific answer. However, we look at the text that they wrote, the main difference in their position is that in the Brahma Sutras, it explains there's an ultimate aim to achieve. And in the Vedantas, the Mimamsa say that the Vedanta says that the ultimate aim is achieving liberation, but the Mimamsa say that it is ritual. So by achieving ritual, you achieve liberation, but the Mimamsa primarily said that the main aspect is performing rituals. So basically, when you talk about the time when, and the Vedantas take the philosophy as its source, the ultimate liberation of humans. And so it's probably around the beginning of the first millennium that the Vedanta appeared. And its founder was probably a sage named Badarayana. It's called Badarayana. Another name for him is Vyasa. Now, this sage is probably a person of the 1st century, but we cannot clearly say what his date of birth was. Now, the most important treatise of this tradition is, one of them is called, a text called the Prachannapada, the treatise on scriptures, and it's written by a master named Gaudapada. And so later there was another well-known Vedanta scholar. He was in fact one of the most well-known masters in all of India, and he's called Adi Shankara. And so so Adi Shankara basically determined what the meaning of the Brahma Sutras are and developed a new school called the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual Vedanta. So both, Prachana, so Gaudapada and Shankara are both, this text by those, both of their texts are the text that they both wrote became very influential in non-Buddhist views. In particular, Shankara's view of Brahma and the emptiness taught in the Buddhist middle ways texts are extremely similar in terms of the way their essence is described. So even within the Veda school, even within the Vedanta school, some people say that Shankara was secretly a Buddhist. He was pretending to be a Hindu, but in actuality, he was a Buddhist, and so many people objected to him for that reason. There's quite a bit to say about this topic, but there's not so much time today, so I won't speak about it. If there is time in the future, I will go into more detail. So in general, we have the Vedanta, and particularly we have the Vedanta school. The non-dual Vedanta school became very widespread in India. So nowadays, when you look in the Indian literature and in the Indian traditions, they speaks about the features of the traditions of there are many aspects. You can see many traces of the Advaita Vedanta school in many aspects of Indian culture and literature. Now, what are the main fundamental texts of the Vedanta? It's the Brahma Sutras is the main one. Now, as I said, this was written by the Badarayana, as I mentioned. Now, the Vedantas themselves say that they're actually the source of their philosophy is the Upanishads, but actually it's not the but actually, when they determine what their phenomena is, they use when they want to, they say that the Brahma Sutras are their main text, but when they really want to establish their philosophy, they use the quotations from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras. And so these are the ones that they primarily use. So even within them, it's they say that it's the Brahma Sutra that is the primary text that they accept and explain. And so within this, there is the awareness of Brahma Vidya, which is like they recognize the essence of their school and they primarily investigate that. Now, the Brahma Sutra has 4 different chapters, and each of these has 4 internal sections. And it has a total of about 555 stanzas. And the time that it was developed is probably the latest of the six Orthodox schools. It appeared in the Common Era already. Now, I've been speaking about the before Common Era and Common Era, but I think there might be some who don't know the difference between the before Common Era and the Common Era, because many of our Sangha members haven't gone to schools, and they probably don't know what the before Common Era and the Common Era is. So for that reason, I'll describe the difference between the before Common Era and Common Era tomorrow. So if you think of the word Vedanta, this word is present before. So it appears in the Vedas and in some Buddhist texts as well. Now, the main positions, the main tenets of the Vedanta school is that they say that there's an all-pervasive God. So the entire world in the actual nature is Brahma. Everything arose from Brahma. Their origin is within Brahma. They arise from the expanse of Brahma. In the end, they dissolve back into Brahma. So if you say Brahma, when you talk about Brahma, it's not identified as like some sort of individual God. It means like the nature of things. The entire world arises from the expanse of Brahma. So what the Brahmas say is that you've got the knowing Purusha, the self, and you've got the primal nature, and that they are separate in nature. They are 2 different things. And so they refute that. They object to that. And the Vaishakas say that everything is made out of atoms. They also object to that. And what the Brahma says that they are not separate entities, but they are one in essence. The nature of all phenomena is, we say that the nature of all phenomena is the empty Dharma Dhatu. Similarly, we say that the nature of everything is emptiness, and they explain that everything is Brahma by nature. And these are actually very similar. So I don't need to explain this in great detail right now, because I'm getting tired about it too, and it's difficult for you to understand it all right away. So I don't need to go into too much detail right now. So I'm going to give you a summary here. It's not right. I wouldn't be right if I didn't give you a summary. So I'm going to give you a summary, and that'll be enough for the 6 Orthodox schools. Now, to give the summary, I've given basically brief introductions to all of the 6 Orthodox schools, but in terms of their tenets, I of course studied a lot. But if I explain it, I have to teach more. But if I would teach more, there's not time. And if I teach it in brief, then you won't understand. So it's better not to say it. So I haven't really said much. But if you kind of summarize their main points, the Samkhya school says that they identify the 2 basic constituents of all of the world and all phenomena. They say that all phenomena arise from these 2 basic constituents. The Yoga school says that there is a great Ishvara, creator God, who transcends all things. And then the Nyaya school determine what the nature is primarily through valid logic. And they developed a new logical system. And the Vaisheshika school said that the entire world comes from many permanent atoms. And the Mimamsa says primarily that Brahma said that the Vedic rituals are the nature, the basic nature. And so they took great interest in this and they explained them. The last one is the Vedantas, and they said all phenomena arise from Tsampa, and the self and the Brahma are the sameness, and they're not two. They explain it in this way, right? So basically, when you talk about the Samkhya and the Yoga school in the actual meaning, they're generally the same. And in the Yoga Sutra, they basically accept all of the logical positions taken in the Samkhya school. And then in addition to that, what they add is that the Samkhya said that there is no creator God, or that there's no proof of a God. And in place of that, the Yoga school says that there is a God, Ishvara. So they add that. But that God, Ishvara, is basically a focus of their meditation on the nature, but they don't give a great detailed philosophical presentation of the nature of that God in a logical fashion, in a profound way. And so for that reason, there are very few disagreements between the Sankhya and the Yoga. In actuality, they're like this. They're like their older and younger siblings. Now, the Nyaya, what they are, when you look at the Nyaya schools, so they're always only speaking about logical texts, they're always talking about the presentations of validity, but in actuality, their aim is they're striving towards a liberation. So in actuality, they become a philosophy. Now, the Vaisheshika schools, they say that everything is composed of atoms, so their explanation is basically physics. It's not really a philosophy. And so in addition, later, the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika basically became one tradition. Now, the Mimamsa and the Vedanta, with the Mimamsa, first of all, they took interest in rituals. They emphasized rituals. So they only emphasized rituals, and so it's difficult to say that they're a philosophical tradition. The Vedanta determined the meanings of the philosophies from the Upanishads. So basically, when you look at this, the name, there are 6 different philosophies, 6 orthodox schools, but in actuality, when you look at it, when you look at the actual, there are only 3 really philosophical schools. The first is the Samkhya and the Rinpoche, and both of these have really a very strong view of a non-theistic view, where they don't assert a creator. And so it's because they're coming close to an atheistic point of view, and so the ones that are really accord with the Vedas and say that there is a creator God, the one that is the orthodox view, if you have to present, it's really only Vedanta that you can present as being an orthodox view. And so for that reason, it's considered very important in the Brahma tradition, in the Hindu religion. It comes down to this reason. Now, if we think about these, did these 6 schools appear before Buddhism? No. So I'm speaking about the 6 orthodox schools before the Buddhists. So you might think to yourself, oh, they must have appeared before the Buddhists. But actually, there's no certainty in that. It's not definite. There is a Japanese scholar named Kimura Taiken. And what he says is that the Vedanta and the Yogas and the Vaisheshika and the Nyaya all show traces or influence of Buddhism. And so for that reason, most of the 6 orthodox schools appeared after the original forms of Buddhism appeared. He says this may be said. So this is his said. When we talk about original Buddhism, I will speak about this tomorrow. So what do we mean when we say original Buddhism? I'll speak about this tomorrow. So now when you talk about the reason why we put these 6 Orthodox schools in one group is that there's not a whole lot about them in Chinese. There's not much in the Chinese language. And the Japanese scholars also do not know so much about them. So basically, in our traditional ways, whether in China, we often talk about the six non-Buddhist teachers. There are very few who speak about the 6 philosophical schools. And it's a similar situation within our Tibetan Buddhism. There's no single group for the 6 Orthodox schools. We speak a lot about the Charvaka and the Nyaya and so forth, but they're all kind of separate. They're kind of like fragmented. And they're not brought together as one group and called the six Orthodox schools. So to bring them into one section, so bringing the 6 into one group is something that developed only in modern times in India, only in the last few centuries. As I'm explaining it now, as I'm saying. In the past, there were people who talked about these 6 Orthodox schools, but the way they were grouped and the way I'm explaining it now is very different. The way they explained it is very different from how I'm explaining it now. And so they had a different way of ordering the six schools. However, later, in the Indian histories of philosophies and when scholars explain the Brahmanical philosophies, they speak primarily about the 6 darshanas, the 6 Orthodox schools. And so for this reason, I think there's we have no choice but to take some interest in them as well. So for these reasons, in order to make it easy to explain, I've given you this presentation of these 6 Orthodox schools. So that is basically it for today. So now I've spoken about the 6 Orthodox schools, and it's difficult to speak about 6 great philosophical traditions in one day, but I have just, plowed through it as much as I can. Now, our schedule has changed a little bit, so I think that I need to explain it again. So tomorrow is the 7th of September. So since tomorrow is the 7th of September, we will have a teaching tomorrow on the 7th. On the 8th, we will have a day off. We will have teachings on the 9th and 10th. On the 11th, we will have a day off. And we will have 2 more days of teaching on the 12th and 13th of September. Originally, the plan was to finish on the 12th, but we need to extend it by 1 day. Now, you might think that if you keep on adding days, it's never going to end. But it's difficult to keep adding more days. It's not so easy. So I'm going to say that that's how it is. So from tomorrow on, I have to give an introduction to the non-Buddhist Lokayantra Charvaka schools, then also to the Jain school. And then after I introduce these 2, then I'll begin to speak about the Buddhist school. And so there'll be 4 or 5 days to speak about Buddhism, and I will say as much as I can during those 5 days. But I'm not going to rush through it, because we don't always have the opportunities to do it. So if I'm to rush through it now and don't say the things that need to be said, then it's kind of a bit of a loss. So I won't rush, and I'll go through and take the time to go through it. Eventually, we need to speak about mantra. But we have to get there first. And the way I'm working is I'm going like a turtle. Like a turtle goes slowly. And so it's like it's never going to get to mantra. Now, the topic eventually is going to, the aim is to speak about, the original aim is to speak about mantra, but there's so much to say until we get there. There's so much background history that needs to be taught. Now, originally, I thought about speaking in a very simple way, but then it got more complicated and more and more. And so now I'm just having trouble stopping myself. So I've basically spoken about the non-Buddhist subjects, and so I think we will begin with Buddhism tomorrow. So generally, the topic of philosophy is more difficult than normal. You have to read a lot of texts, and the sources are in so many different languages, in English and Chinese and Japanese and so many other languages. And I have to dig through them, all of them. And some of them I can handle, and some of them I can't do it. So I have to always have to ask other people for help. And so I haven't even had, it's basically, I haven't had a minute to rest. And so for that reason, when I'm teaching this, I'm only saying a little bit. When I prepared, there's a whole lot that I had to prepare. And even in terms of the amount that I prepared, it's basically about if I could present even 50% of what I prepared, I couldn't even do that. So now we will recite the dedication prayers.